Great. Thanks, Shane. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And in particular, I want to thank our speaker, Bill Trainor of Mutual Capital Partners, for joining us today. One of the challenges with medical devices is if the device requires patient or physician behavior change, that can be a challenge in getting adoption of the product or the success of it as well. And wanted to dive into that topic a little bit more. So let's go ahead and bring up Bill. Bill, thank you for joining us. Can you say again? I didn't hear Bill.
Oh, can you not hear me? I'm sorry.
There you go. Yeah, the microphone didn't pick it up the first time, but thanks for that. Let's go ahead and start off with, tell us more about yourself and your fund.
Great. I started Mutual Capital Partners at the end of 2004, originally focused on Midwest technology. I guess we were kind of pioneers in the idea of the rise of the rest. We're a Cleveland, Ohio-based venture fund, and we just saw that there was a lack of venture capital in the Midwest. We had seen a number of seed opportunities trying to get started and get to a certain point and then maybe go away. A couple of other Series A funds that had some success, but then ran upmarket into more growth equity type of rounds. And so we had a thesis of investing in Midwest technology businesses, not really anything more specific than that. We raised a little validation fund in 2005. And made a half a dozen investments, and 3-4 years later, basically figured out our thesis was wrong. We needed way more money. We needed to syndicate better, all the kind of usual first-time fund challenges. Fortunately, we had very supportive LPs. They co-invested with us. Our companies made it through, and we ended up with 4 successful exits out of that first fund. Which allowed us to raise a second fund. 2012, we raised a second fund, double the size of the first fund. Then we decided to focus specifically on med devices and B2B software, made 6 more investments in that space, had an exit already, and then have 5 other portfolio companies that range from 10 million of ARR to a company approaching 100 million this year. So we were kind of all over the board. And we realized that late into our second fund that it's just very, very difficult to be helpful to your portfolio companies if they're all touching B2B is software, if you will, is such a huge industry. We just felt like we couldn't get the cross-pollination effect. And the same thing, we called it med devices, but one was a diagnostic assay, the other was an actual surgical tool. We just weren't getting the synergistic effect of the portfolio. So we raised our third fund in 2017, made 7 investments in that fund. That fund was about the size of the first 2 combined. And we went all in on healthcare, and specifically med devices and medical tools and HIT software. And so the theme that we look at is businesses on the device side that better for the doctors, makes their job easier, faster, both better patient outcomes, and ultimately the same or less price for the system and the payers. And then on the software side, we're really looking for tools that make the kind of growing staff inefficiency within the marketplace have a chance to either catch up or get ahead of the demands being put on them. So again, same sort of idea, tools that make a doctor or a nurse or a general practitioner more efficient in their day-to-day business. And then in that third fund, that's when we really saw the cross-pollination benefits of making those types of investments. And we're doubling down on that in our newest fund, which we just kicked off about a month ago. And all I shared with you, fundraising has been going exceptionally well. So we're excited to get back into the market. We've made 1 investment out of that new fund already, and looking to make 6, 7, 8 more out of our 4th fund as well.
Well, that's great. Let's talk more about the medical devices. Which ones have you had experience with, and what's your take on the current medical device landscape?
So we are fortunate. We see a lot of opportunities. Where we've had the most success has been in and around the orthopedics side of the equation. We've done some cardiovascular things. We have a couple of portfolio companies in the neurostimulation space, but they're used a lot in and around the orthopedic practice groups as well. So there is some commonality there. And I think the biggest thing that we're looking for is we're not pre-FDA approved investors. So we are looking for that process to be basically done at the time we want to dive in on the diligence front. We'll start a diligence process with an expected FDA approval. We probably wouldn't write the check though until there's at least some commercial revenue from that device being used by some doctors. And I would say more the norm for us is we want to talk to a handful of surgeons and systems and payers that will tell us exactly why they're excited for that technology. And on the surgeon side, like I said, it can't just be an incremental step. It's got to be a big step. We have a shoulder replacement technology that saves surgeons on average 15 to 30 minutes of surgery. That's just an amazing amount of time. But on top of that, it's also bone sparing for the patients. So it enables them to have more optionality if there are any other problems that they incur later in their life. And from a price perspective, it's priced right in the middle of the pack where all the other, right where the CPT code is. And so it was just kind of a no-brainer for us when you save a system and a doctor a whole bunch of time and you end up with better patient outcomes and the payers in the system are all comfortable with the price point. It was a very easy decision process for us to make. And that's kind of the theme of what we look at with every device company that's out there. Now, there's layers and layers and layers of nuance. You gotta like the team because you're really investing in the team, not the technology. They have to have some ideas on future product development and where they're taking the technology. You want to try to build some, kind of moats and fences around that technology and expand out from there. So there has to be, called vision, team, and a willingness to collaborate on top of everything else. But the bare minimum is, kind of that the technical and the due diligence feedback out from the market that really gets us excited to spend the amount of time that we would need to spend with the team and everyone else to move forward and write a check.
Great. Now, beside FDA, what is the biggest challenge with medical devices?
It's probably systemic to every startup, Paul. It's more of the expectation that it will take much less time than it really does to get out into the marketplace. And you can build the best mousetrap ever. It can be, way more effective, way better, cheaper, all that other stuff. You still have to go out and sell. You have to educate the market. And I wouldn't say you're necessarily changing patient perspectives. That tends to be more of a consumer play, especially in and around pharma, which is not a space we play in, although you do see some of the med device companies doing some advertising for their various implants or devices or technology. But for your bread and butter, venture-backed startup in the med device space, I would say, they just expect, we're going to do $1 million in year one and 10 million in year two and 25 million in year three. And we've backed a lot of very successful companies, and it's usually more like year 5 when they hit 25 million if things are going well, and it might even be 20 million. It takes a lot longer and a lot more work to get these technologies out and adopted in the marketplace. Every hospital has a VAC, which is basically assessing whether or not to let that device come into their business, come into their system. And they don't meet like every day, so there's some timing and there's some massaging. You've got to provide data and information to them. And each VAC is a little bit different. I mentioned the cross-pollination effect. That's the beauty of, we have companies now that have sold to every health system in the United States. They have a folder on every VAC out there. So there aren't any big surprises anymore. And that does help us to accelerate some of the timing once we invest in the business to get to that commercial traction. But for the most part, I would just say it takes a lot longer than everyone expects. And that, that's even me sometimes. Even I think, okay, they've got a really good chance of hitting 3 million this year, and they'll do 2.5. And that 2.5 is still really good if it's up from $1 million, but that's $500,000 of very high gross margin revenue that did not come in, which means you burn more time and you burn more cash, which means your fume date is coming sooner. And the ultimate goal always is to get to a level of 50 to 100% above the post-money valuation before a company needs to go raise their next round of capital, so that everyone is kind of happy with the next follow-on round. And to do that, you've got to hit some pretty aggressive growth opportunities, or you just won't hit those metrics.
Great. Well, startups are all about innovation. What happens when a startup comes with a new technology that requires patient or physician behavior change. We now have to do it differently. I find doctors are very resistant to that. What do you do in that case?
You're exactly right, Paul. I was just having lunch with an investor and he had both of his knees replaced in the last half a year. And the first knee, it was done manually, no technology at all. The doctor basically eyed his knee up with the corner of the room and put the implant in, and that's how it happened. And then the second knee was done by the same doctor, but in a different environment using a surgical robot. And the cutting lines were better. The rehab has been a little bit smoother. He did mention, though, that also could have been because he didn't know what to expect the first time through. He did know what to expect the second time. He'd already been going through rehab the first time, so he knew what to do the second time. But he said the funny thing was the doctor was kind of kicking and screaming to use the technology. But he had to use it because there wasn't any other surgical space available. And it was part of the contract that they had with that center for that operating room to use that. They had to use the robot. So, the doctor used it, but I would say he used it begrudgingly. And he even said to the patient after, they're also, friendly, kind of golf course friendly. And he said to the patient afterward that he would not go to that ambulatory surgery center again, or if he did, he'd go into one of the other operating rooms. So again, he's a more seasoned orthopedic surgeon. Some of the new ones probably are very excited to embrace technology, and we think that's a benefit too, because if you just rely on the oldest surgeons, I mean, it takes a lot longer to get them to make those changes. If you've been doing the same type of surgery for 25 years and it's been working, it's kind of hard to change your mindset on why you should try something new without a ton of clinical data and support behind you. And that costs a startup a lot of money. That is, prospective studies, retrospective studies, it's clinical, data that you might get a 510(k) approval, but you still have to spend a bunch of money on a blind study just to get some efficacy. And even then, we had a device company one time in the cardiovascular space, and it was an interventional nephrologist that specifically said, well, you've done 4,000 surgeries so far. That's great. Come back to me when you've done 10, because I don't think you're statistically relevant at 4,000 surgeries. We were like, oh, okay, we learned that. And that's something we pay close attention to now with all of our companies.
Well, aside from clinical data, what else can you use to change the physician's mind and get more adoption of new technologies?
If you can find thought leaders that are influential in their space, that are very, it's not preachy. They come across much more as, educational thought leaders, and they're publishing their own studies or their own reviews. They can be influential as well. I think if you can, if you can find a doctor that a lot of them, they have a bunch of great ideas, but no one's ever asked them before. If you can find, talk to them, and you can get them thinking about how to share ideas in and around how to make a surgical procedure better, they might be willing to then use the technology that you're providing to see how that might change some of their thoughts or enhance some of their thoughts on how to make that procedure better. So, it's not like the days of old where the, med device reps used to take people on, 2-week-long vacations and this and that. That kind of falls into the Sunshine Act of, you have to disclose, doctor payments, doctor shareholders, doctor advisors, any equity holder, all that other stuff. It's, transparency is a good thing here, and that has helped to level the playing field, but only so much. It's take a Johnson & Johnson may have 5,000 med device salespeople in the United States. All of our portfolio companies combined probably don't have 1,000. So it's just apples and oranges and what you can do. And that's 1,000, including distributors and this and that, and they're all selling other things as well. So yeah, it's an uphill battle, but that's why you have to have good backers, because it's going to take a little more time and a little more money than you think it is. And as long as everyone kind of has that idea up front or understands it not too long after you've made the investment, you can build a successful business.
I mean, how effective are financial incentives such as higher reimbursement or lower costs? How much does that move the needle?
The cost helps with the VAC. The cost helps with the system for sure. If you can provide studies back to the payers can be helpful in that process as well, in terms of, approvals and recommendations and everything else. I would say, the bigger thing would be on that CPT code side of the equation. I mean, we have a spine implant company that has developed a new novel technology. It's called Elevation Spine, and they've taken a single device and captured 2 CPT codes doing it. So if you are a surgeon and you have the chance to get paid twice versus one time, and it's better for the patient as well, that's a win all the way across the board. And so we do look at those opportunities, but we have not seen a tremendous amount of success at people coming in and try, other than very, very big companies that can afford the marketing, the education, the conference, just all the expense of education. We haven't seen many people come in and sell what I would call a Cadillac product in a Chevy environment.
Well, how often do you coach a startup to go after a new reimbursement code, which may have higher returns, versus an existing code, which is standard, but it's there, you can use it right away? What do you advise people to do?
We obviously get a pricing consultant. We also work with a couple of payers that we're close with to try to understand the pathway to getting that independent CPT code. So you have to do a review of that. And if you feel like you can, have a good chance at getting it, you can go for it. It does require a lot of data, which data is time, data is money. And so you have to feel really good about your chances of doing it because it takes a long time, it takes a lot of money to do. But if you get it, that's an amazing thing. Now, if you're perfectly fine with the reimbursement that you're going to get, because your technology is materially better and you're getting the same price as the competing technology, that can work very well all day long as well. We have a number of med device companies. They're really not even in the CPT side of the equation. I mean, they're really more on the they're paid out of the general surgery reimbursement. So to a degree, that's less money coming into that hospital doctor, that overall procedure, but the benefit by using that technology far outweighs what they're sacrificing in the cost to use that technology. But that's definitely a harder sell. You better have the data to be able to prove that.
Great. A question from the audience is there a rule of thumb as to when a device does not need FDA approval? How do you know you need FDA approval just to look at it?
Well, I think, intraoperatively or, anything that's implanted has to have FDA approval. We don't really look at, and we use the FDA approval as a way of kind of delineating. It's basically, it's kind of a barrier to entry, if you will. It helps to establish where you are in the marketplace and that you're clinically reviewed. It helps your intellectual property side of the equation as well. And like I said, those moats and those fences are very, very important. So I might be missing something that, is used intraoperatively that isn't FDA approved. It's not an area that we spend any time on at all. If we see a device, if we see something that comes in as a device, one of the first questions we ask is, where are you in the regulatory pathway? And, if you've already had it, when was that granted? Where are you on the IP side of the equation? When did you file? Have you already received your patent? How long is the life of that patent? Those types of barriers are important because it is a long fight. And if your stuff starts to go off patent, you've lost a wall.
All right. So what role does the physician have in the startup's product development role?
It varies. We have some investors that are surgeons that are absolutely amazing surgeons. They are so thoughtful and helpful in our due diligence. They're wonderful at looking at new opportunities, and there is not a creative bone in their mind or thought in their mind on how to potentially, materially improve things. They may have some small tweaks and feedback on this and that, but coming up with a novel technology that is not just a nominal step forward, but a real step forward, that's a unique animal. That's a very, very different type of person. And I don't know what the percentages are, but I would venture to say if there's for every 10 surgeons, maybe one of them has that kind of, strong desire, that strong entrepreneurial zeal to want to push things forward, because it does require a lot of work. I mean, you have to convince a broader base advisory board if you're a part of that medical advisory board, and then you have to go through all the prototyping and the IP check and eventually the FDA approval. It requires some commitment. And then eventually, if you get all of that, you have to be willing to be one of those surgeons that is not only going to be a user and making sure that it is useful and doing everything that you thought it was going to do, but then you got to get on the podium and stump for it as well. Or maybe you're not comfortable speaking. Maybe it's hosting a cadaver lab where you have, surgeons come in and you run the training and the education portion of getting them up to speed on the benefits of that technology. So it's a multi-year commitment for sure.
Well, most startups talk about how effective their technology is, especially in the medical device space. And once in a while, I'll hear someone say that the physicians prefer it based on a superficial survey. How much does that sway you as an investor to go after the one that's got good physician buy-in, or you think would be better for them?
Yeah, I mean, superficial is tough. It's very, very hard to build a company over a feature. We when we were more broad-based generalist software investors, you would see companies that would have like a few more features than the competition, and that's great. But as we all know, it doesn't take long for other people to develop more features. It's kind of every release, people are putting more features out there. So it's kind of the same way on the device side of the equation, that if it's just a feature enhancement, it's not really interesting to us. But if it's a novel step forward, we have a company, SPR Therapeutics, that has a single or dual lead, slightly subcutaneous technology that attaches to a stimulator, and over the course of a 5-week regimen is highly effective at reducing chronic pain. And the long and the short of it is the body gives itself a little chance to retrain itself, calm down, heal internally, and the effective rate is very, very high. And the competition for that is opioids at one end or invasive surgery at the other. And no one wants to do invasive surgery because it involves a whole host of other issues. And opioids are clearly not a great long-term solution. So they've had tremendous success because of the efficacy of that product. But I will tell you, we watched that company for over half a decade before they got to the point where their revenue, their valuation, everything kind of aligned with our thesis as well. And then we invested with a couple of other funds in a fairly sizable round, and the business has done exceptional since then. Again, that's not the norm, but it is indicative of you have to have something that is a lot different, not just a little bit different.
So a question from the audience: what are your general thoughts on dealing with GPOs? Getting through VAC can get you a case, but being on contract gets you paid in more cases.
You're exactly right. And that's where it comes down to, the studies. The GPOs are all about, they want to understand the efficacy. So all of our companies are doing these studies where they're going back to their, the select doctors and doing these independent studies and finding out how, patients that had X implant versus Y implant, how quickly were they load bearing, or were they able to walk or run, or whatever the indication might be. But how did the procedure and the end result compare to the other comparative tech procedure, if you will? And then you just present those case studies to the GPO and hope eventually to be pulled in. It's a long process, and I said about 15 minutes ago, the big boys they've got the leverage because they already have their existing revenue and their profit, and they can afford all that, and they can pull from a much wider swath of you're fighting incumbents. The markets are all growing, which is good, but you're also likely taking market share at some point as well. So, the growth of the overall market is important to us, but you have to know you're going to go head to head with these better funded more established businesses. And that's part of the diligence process of talking to these doctors and understanding, like, having them jumping up and down saying, this is materially better, for the following reasons. And if it covers all of our kind of key criteria, then you just start the long slog to go fight those GPO battles.
Great. Well, we touched on this before, but to dive into it a little bit more, should the physician be financially compensated for using or promoting a medical device technology? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think some of them are. I mean, we have surgeons that design surgeons, when they come up with things, they are paid royalties on that. It is a small royalty. Let's say the average royalty is somewhere in the couple percent of revenue, but you're usually spreading that royalty out across a design team of a number of surgeons that are pulling things together. So it's not enough money that I think a surgeon would walk away from their Hippocratic oath, nor would they walk away just because they make way more money doing the surgeries that they're doing. I would say it's probably enough money for them, initially to maybe have an extra couple of days of vacation. Maybe eventually it gets to the point where it gets them a car, maybe if the business really succeeds. But you think about it, $100 million revenue business with a 2% royalty, and you're talking about paying a group of 6, 8, 10, 12 surgeons some portion of all that stuff. It's about a month of work for most of them anyway. So I do think you throw that in the mix. We also have surgeons that are active investors in these companies as well, that you clearly need to disclose and make sure everyone understands. And it's the company's job to balance that out and make sure that there isn't a reliance on surgeon shareholders to drive the revenue, because that revenue is not the same revenue as a non-shareholder surgeon. But that's the same way in software as well. It's just not as openly disclosed because of healthcare is just more open and transparent. But there's a lot of companies out there that make investments in startups and that are actively out promoting them and using them and everything. But you would never know if it wasn't disclosed. If they chose to remain anonymous or invest through a shell vehicle, you'd never know that they're a major part of the cap table and that they not only could inure shareholder benefit, but might also be getting paid a commission on every sale or this and that. So I like healthcare for that reason. I think it's important to have everything straightforward and make sure everyone's playing as close to on the same field as possible.
Great. Another question from the audience is, at what stage in a venture, preclinical, clinical, post-FDA approval, post-market entry, do you typically invest? And what level of evidence do you need as a VC?
We're really comfortable in the post-clinical initial commercialization phase. If I can see a business at somewhere around $10,000 to $20,000 a month in revenue, that's enough customers, enough initial traction for me to get data from them and then compare it independently with our own sources as well. Like I said, the preclinical is very difficult for us. Maybe if it was right in our backyard where it was in Northeast Ohio, where we could drive and help the team out and kind of have everything ready to go as soon as they get FDA approval and they do the first couple of those cases, we'd maybe put together more of a seed round. But the interesting thing about devices is they cost a lot of money to get through whatever level of trials and regulatory approval to get that. Then you get into the commercialization, and after a year or so, unfortunately, you're kind of valued based on how you've done in the market. So if you've gone out into the market and you have this groundbreaking technology and no one uses it, how much is your business worth? It could be user error. It could be the team just had no ability to transform from a clinical stage team to a commercial stage team. That requires some diligence and work. But in the grand scheme of things, you lost on a large amount of time. Let's call it a year or more. That's a lot of additional cash that you burned. You have to assume that that's your equity value has taken a hit, or probably not increased. Maybe it stayed the same, but it probably hasn't increased. The more revenue you get, the more metricized your business is able to become. that's when it's very, very difficult to get unique valuations. There are always exceptions. There are some entrepreneurs out there that are just exceptionally skilled at selling to individuals, and that's fine. Individuals tend to be less valuation focused. They're more interested in the broader theme and story of the business, but institutional money, venture funds like ours are definitely more metricized as a business matures and goes up the growth curve.
Great. Next question from the audience is, was the medical sector in Cleveland important to your success, or is your view outside that area?
I mean, we love that we're here in Cleveland, Ohio with the Cleveland Clinic and UH, and, you've got Medical Mutual here on the payer side, Summa system in Akron, ProMedica over in Toledo, all the hospital systems in Columbus. I mean, the Midwest in general is blessed with gigantic health systems that receive tons of NIH money, tons of, nonprofit charity money for clinical trials and this and that, lots of collaboration partnership money. I mean, IBM and the Cleveland Clinic just announced a new quantum computing center at the Cleveland Clinic, the first in the country. And that's all really, really exciting. With that being said, as we sit here today, we've made an investment from, 2 investments spin out of the Mayo Clinic, one from the Cleveland Clinic, one from a Summa entity called the Crystal Clinic. I mean, we're not, it's sometimes it's very difficult for those technologies to get through those big systems and actually get to a point where they can become commercially viable, venture backable businesses. And it's the same in academia as well. You can come up with great ideas, but you need to transition in those business people to create a real viable business going forward. And there just seems, on occasion, you just see that sometimes being a little bit of a roadblock at some of these institutions.
And my next question is, should a startup have a physician on the board or the advisory board or the team, or does that make an impact on your decision to invest in a startup?
We think the board should be comprised of people that can mentor the executive team and help them as much as possible. We think a scientific advisory board should have scientists and MDs, PhDs that can help and mentor the team, especially on the product development, the R&D side of the equation. But even on the sales side, it's really important to be able to have the right nomenclature, the right language, the right messaging. And if you have those really smart people to help you out, that's, you should get that type of feedback as well. If a founder wants to be on the board initially and they're a contributing member and they can add a lot of value, that's wonderful. If they can't, we work with them to try and find that right spot. I mean, if it's a sticking point of like, I have to be on the board, it kind of begs the question, why? You could have an observation seat, but maybe you bring in an outside successful med device executive to actually be that real independent voice on behalf of the shareholders. I think that's probably a better longer term outcome than a founder who's never sat on a board before, who may still be a full-time practicing physician who, there's just every situation's different. I mean, you've seen a million of these things also. Everyone is uniquely different. It goes back to that whole team concept. If you can find a team that wants to get better and surround themselves with really smart people that have been there, done that, and can take it to the next level and help you grow as an entrepreneur or founder or team in general, that's a very attractive quality for us on the investment side. Our perspective is the boards can always be open. We don't even care about like executive session. It kind of doesn't matter unless you're talking about stock grants, employee bonuses, or a potential acquisition of some sort in the future. Everything else feels like it should be in the open domain of the senior executive team and maybe even some of the scientific advisory board members. If you're thinking about raising $10 million and spending $5 million to develop something new, that you probably want a little bit of their feedback on that as well. So we're pretty open on that idea.
Great. Well, you touched on the sunshine laws earlier, but can you go into a little bit more detail? What exactly are they and how do they work? For example, can I do anything as a doctor, but I just have to disclose it, or are there limits as to what I can do as a doctor?
I'm not an expert at this by any matter because it does change, and there's some state nuance as well. I think that the grand theme of things, is like, if it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. If you're being paid to do something that you wouldn't do without being paid, you probably shouldn't be doing it, and you probably shouldn't do it at your portfolio company. That's kind of our general theme, and that's the same at the sales level, the marketing level, all this other stuff. It's like, stick to the facts, stick to the basics. If you're going to be giving a speech, you should absolutely disclose in your speech, verbally and in your collateral materials, that you are the founder and you're a shareholder, and that you are paid, some sort of a consulting fee as the, medical advisory board member or chair of the, whatever your position is. Just be transparent about it, because if your technology is that good, don't have it anchored down by someone saying you're only saying it because you're looking for the economic benefit. For the most part, we haven't met many doctors. We've talked to thousands of them. I can only think of a couple where I left the meeting thinking that they're not as interested in the medical side as they are in the monetary side. And that's the beauty of the calling into that field. You can't go through the amount of education and time and energy and sacrifice, both, familial and even financially, the amount of money it costs to become a doctor.
What percent of the startups out there you deal with?
They're generally good people. The what?
Right. Okay. What percent of the startups you deal with you think actually are compensating a doctor in some way? They're on an advisory board or being paid or in somehow financially incentivized. Is it a big number?
It is. I mean, it's probably 100% at the time we get to see them. If you own an equity stake, you're financially compensated. I mean, let's say you own 10% of a business and someone just ascribed a $50 million value to that business, you theoretically have a $5 million book value piece of paper. I mean, that you could make an argument that's pretty damn material to anyone.
Well, I will say most of the startups I talk to in the medical device space, doctors are 10 to 15% at least of their cap table, just because they understand the technology and they want to be a part of it. But I also believe they probably wouldn't invest unless there was some thought that this was helpful to the physician or the patient.
100%. And like, we've talked to thousands of surgeons. I can name a couple, and they might have just been having bad days too. I mean, I don't, you spend an hour, 90 minutes in a meeting with someone. Sometimes you just don't rub off the same way, the right way. It's probably been the same way for me with select people over the years. With that being said, when you're a small venture fund in Cleveland, Ohio, that's a very different thing than working for a, 10 billion in assets fund in the Valley or New York or Boston. You're looking at the world in very, very different lenses. And we're very hands-on. We take active board roles at all of our companies. We want to help bring in smart people, around the table to help us make the right decisions. I mean, we may have a roadmap and a, metrics and a strategy that, and cross-pollination of sharing things across the portfolio with each company, each technology is just slightly unique and different. And it does have to carve its own path a little bit. And we want to make sure we get more optionality for them, because you just don't want to rely on just our thoughts or our co-investors' thoughts or past investors' thoughts. If you can really bring in nuanced, independent thought leaders that have been there, done that, are still doing it, maybe in other businesses, they can be game changers for your portfolio companies.
Great. Last call to the audience for questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. And Bill, for you, I guess my last question is there anything else you'd like to discuss about medical devices? We were talking about AI and data earlier, or maybe there are other topics you think would round out this topic here today.
No, I mean, it's a unique time in this country. We have we have an abundance of demand right now in the medical field. And yet we have a huge problem with, we don't have enough doctors. We don't have enough nurses. even the ones we have, we can't keep them. They all worked 7 days a week forever and ever and ever. It's just one of those things where, like, I think we're in a unique window of time that without technical tools making things easier, better, faster for all parties, we're not going to be able to keep up with the aging of the baby boomer demographics. And everyone in general wants to live longer, healthier lives. And you can't train a doctor fast enough. We're not turning surgery over to robots in any time in the near future. And until stuff like that happens, you gotta take an hour-long surgery. And if you can make it 45 minutes, guess what? If the person's doing that 6 times a day, they can now do a 7th. And why would they do a 7th? Because they can help out one more person and they get paid, 1/7 more for the work that they just did. So I think it's a great time to be investing in healthcare.
Great. And one last comment in the chat box is sunshine is generally reported on company level, granular level. If I'm a rep and take a surgeon to dinner, I have to detail the dinner and the total receipt divided by number of the heads of the dinner. There's actually software that auto-populates surgeons' NPI numbers. Any feedback there? No,
it's exactly right. That's anything we do at any level within our portfolio companies is documented. You never want to have something come back and bite you in the butt, because the general thesis is the doctor isn't there for a free dinner. She's not there. They're there to learn about technology that's going to make their life better. On the grant, I just mentioned all the sacrifice. If a doctor is going to dinner with you, they're not at home having dinner with their families in all likelihood. I'm sure there are lots of single doctors out there, or whatever, but even not, they still have charting and reading and other things that they could be doing. They're using that as a portion of their time to get educated on something they think they can implement in their practice.
Right. And one more question. In the orthopedic space, do you see the trend is moving to patient-specific solutions such as CT-based guides, implants, et cetera?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. We've seen a number of companies that are trying to do personalized implants, this and that. I think the future will be there. Right now you can 3D print implants and this and that. The challenge is, you need to have it in a biomaterial that is approved by the FDA. So if you're willing to go through the clinical trial work necessary to have a device printed, ready to go, and it is form specific, you probably got to test it on thousands of patients, and more likely have to have them have it in their bodies for years and years and years with no adverse outcomes. For that, everyone knows what stainless steel does in the body. It's been used forever and ever and ever. So I look forward to the day when stuff like that can happen, because every minute you're under where a doctor is making a slight bend or a slight tweak to an existing implant or whatever else is another minute you're under, there's risk, infection risk, or, long-term recovery from anesthesia, it's just all that kind of stuff. And so, that's where the puck is going. I don't know how far down the ice it is yet. We're watching and definitely waiting, but I think we got a little more time.
Great. And one last question about venture in Cleveland. Are there a lot of LPs in Cleveland, the AKA undercover billionaire? What do you find there?
Cleveland's a really interesting market. Like a lot of the Midwest, it apexed in the Industrial Revolution. I mean, the amount of patents and everything filed, in Cleveland kind of hit a peak in the 1940s and has declined from there. With that being said, it's a very, very wealthy, proud, old line industrial city. It's on a pro rata basis, it's probably got one of the highest percentages of GDP to charity in the world. It's just an unbelievable amount of money that is donated around, and that's because of the old families, the old wealth. With that being said, there's a lot of interest in risk capital. It's nothing like Silicon Valley or Silicon Alley, Austin, all that other stuff, but it's way more than, if you read US news, it's like Cleveland is the 72nd, country or city in the United States, because the reason we're that far down is because the city of Cleveland proper doesn't include any of the suburbs. There's, like Indianapolis, geographically, if you put the same geography of Columbus around Cleveland, we'd be like 3 million people. So they're just talking about like the downtown Cleveland area where, there just aren't as many homes as there are in the suburbs. And so it's not as terrible as people make it out to be. And once again, that's Cleveland. Everyone thinks the lake catches on fire, every other day here still.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bill. And at that point, I'd love to hear your comments on our next presenter, Ashley Kennedy. Ashley, if you could come on up and give us a presentation on Neurovine, and then we'll see what questions Bill and the others have for you there. With that, Ashley, go ahead and kick it off.
Thanks, Hall. It's great to be with you today. My name is Ashley Kennedy. I am a neuroscientist by training. My father played professional football. And when I was quite young, there was one of his teammates died by suicide. And that early experience has really thrown me into understanding more about brain recovery. I was fortunate enough to be a student athlete at Stanford and built my first EEG headband there, and that really just launched me into the industry. Just fell in love with the ability to see what's going on in a patient's brain recovery journey, empower them to participate in that recovery journey while providing the clinician with the data to make brain health visible. As you all know, every aspect of our healthcare is visible except the brain. And the company that we've built at Neurovine is changing the way that we take care of the recovery process. We're a digital therapeutic company. We combine wearable technology with a robust AI-driven backend. We collect a huge amount of data on the life cycle of a brain recovery process, and our first focus is on concussion. The technology platform was designed alongside a clinician. My co-founder is a family medicine physician who was really frustrated with not having the data he needed to make medically informed decisions. And so the platform enables better patient management. We're also able to share the data that we've captured. And our early clinical validation has shown that this technology speeds the concussion recovery process. We've got a pretty stellar team, really mission-driven, focused on the brain recovery process. We're serial entrepreneurs, successful exits, more than 15 products launched, and 14 granted patents in this space between the four of us. The first focus, as I mentioned, is concussion. Today, we do have patients with long COVID using this technology, but in terms of bringing this technology to market, we are working with organizations, particularly sports teams, supporting concussion recovery. And as I mentioned, currently, brain recovery is so subjective. It's very difficult to track what's going on, what intervention the patient needs, and to determine when they're ready to go back to play or back to work for that matter. And so the solution that we've built not only identifies the areas that need early intervention, but provides targeted therapeutic intervention directly to the patient. We support mental health along the journey, and we make this process more affordable because we are providing early personalized intervention directly to the patient. I can get into more on how the platform works after the presentation, but I want to touch on the clinician backend. So this is a clinical portal, again, that makes the clinician's job more efficient and effective. During COVID, we were in the middle of our clinical trials, and 80% of our patients never saw their physician in person, which meant that we had people in rural areas being taken care of by physicians in city centers. They would have never been connected without that virtual capacity of the technology. Generation 2 of our backend is a clinical decision support system. So we're looking to file a breakthrough designation for that. And that really allows us to dive into prognosis, equipping the family doc to be the quarterback for this type of brain injury so that a patient can get that early treatment from their family physician. And the early clinical trials that we've completed show a significant improvement in mental health for our patients. We're seeing faster recovery and better symptoms after a 60-day intervention. The faster recovery is associated with having a really clear graduated return back to work. So you're not going back to work and then needing to take another 2 weeks off because of symptoms. We've got a very graduated, clear return back to the office and back to sport. The market that we're in is significant. Companies like Blue Cross Blue Shield, they're spending more than $10 billion a year on concussion. The reason is it is impossible to get back to work if you're one of those patients who has lingering symptoms post-concussion. And that's really the population that we're targeting and supporting. The competitive advantage of our team is significant. And we've been there, we've done it. We know exactly what's going on in the brain health space and how to deliver the product into our customers' hands. And we've got a good intellectual property portfolio that's growing quarter by quarter. And then the infrastructure that we've developed is set up to share this data anonymously with payers and providers. So as I mentioned, we've completed our first clinical trial. We have a second larger RCT going on right now, randomized control trial. And we have already launched the product. We're in market with sports organizations. So it's a B2B offering that we've developed. This allows us to get some really good real world evidence on how the technology is working. We've got a gross margin of 85% with the hardware included. And we've got some really important branding opportunities that we're partnering with today, including the UFC and some major league organizations. And we have completed a controlled release last month. It was valued at $95,000. So we generated $95K in March. The controlled release continues through this quarter, and we're really scaling up to a full product launch in Q3. And so we're already working with those 16 orgs that we'd like to bring on in Q3. They are mostly professional sports teams looking at a pilot with the UFC. The branding opportunity there is significant for us. We know that next generation of the technology is distribution partnerships. And so we started conversations with Mayo Clinic, Highmark Health, and a couple other organizations that we would like to partner with as we move into distribution in 2024. The reason that we're able to sell to organizations today is because there's a huge awareness of brain health within sports. Athletes are highly incentivized to get back on the field, and team docs right now are making subjective calls that are getting them into hot water. And so this is a data-driven approach to really support those patients through their recovery journey. And so to date, we've raised $4 million. We're now raising a small equity round of $2 million. This gives us 24 months of runway and allows us to generate $1 million in revenue. Again, we're already working with those clients. We're bringing into the pipeline in Q4. We're also filing a breakthrough designation on the back end on the clinical decision support system. So I would love to answer any questions that you've got on the platform that we've built. We were lucky enough to be named on the Digital Health 150 list this year, and we do see some significant opportunity within the digital therapeutic space, specifically in brain health.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Bill, what questions do you have?
The presentation, very interesting.
Can you tell me a little bit about the, competitive landscape? Like we've heard some pitches from other people, and it's, intra-helmet, and it's, post, would love to just kind of get your perspective as an expert on this. Like, what are other options out there?
Yeah, that's right. So, Bill, when we look at the competitive landscape, there's two groups of companies. There are people who are focused on the diagnostic side. And so that's companies like, we've got BrainScope as a good example of the diagnostic side. They are, it's really important to have a data-driven diagnostic, but it doesn't support the patient between clinical visits. And that's really where the mistakes happen or the progress is made. I don't know if you've ever had a concussion, but I did have one 18 months ago, and that recovery is such a lonely process, and your mental health suffers significantly. So the other group of competitors that we see are focused on supporting mental health of patients. So we look at a company like Twill. I think they could be a really cool strategic partner for Neurofine, but how do we support that patient journey and really empower the patient? And Twill does a great job of this, but they're not data driven. And so again, it's all reliant on subjective patient assessments, patient subjective feedback, I would say.
That's great. And then when you're in the funnel slide that you had, what has been the objective or the objections when you've been talking to people? Like what is the market telling you, that they like or dislike about what you're doing?
Yeah, so, as you've been discussing, it's patient adoption, it's clinical uptake. Initially, when we were running our clinical trials, we were working with private clinics, so physiotherapists who are cranking patients through, and changing the way that they practice is difficult. It's still difficult with sports teams, but this is their bread and butter, right? Getting those athletes back on the field. And so the objections are still patient adoption and really ensuring that those customers are supported through the recovery journey. And so one of our early hires has been a customer success individual that really walks the patient and the trainers through that recovery process.
Yep. So this might be a controversial question or concept, but like if I'm the owner of an NFL team or an NHL team, do I want the data? Do I want to really know?
Yeah. So we're not saying the person is clear to go back on the field or not. What we're doing is doing an assessment after the concussion takes place so that the trainer can understand exactly which systems are injured and prescribe the right therapeutic intervention so they're getting back onto the field faster. This was exactly, some of my logic at the beginning of building the company, but what we found is if the trainer has data on how to get their player back on the field faster and safer, they want that data. If we're saying the person can't go back on the field, that's more controversial.
Yep, I totally get that. And I guess the last question, I don't want to hog this if other people are chiming in, but have you ever thought about going after like let's say, the NCAA is probably too big, but let's say like the Big Ten or the SEC or, someone like that, because it does feel to me like it's one of those scenarios where if you could get that top down buy-in, like this is a little bit like people really rebelled against the idea of wearing seatbelts forever and ever and ever and ever, despite the clinical proof that like you're going to be better off not, wearing one than not wearing one. And, I think everyone knows we've all been, hearing about the challenges and problems of, the multi-concussions, and everything else. And the sport has definitely changed in my lifetime. It's faster, harder, more violent, all that other stuff. So just curious, especially at that collegiate level. I mean, I know it's a business funneling people to the NFL and such, but it's still, most of the people are never going to play in the NFL. Most of them you hope can be productive members of society outside of football.
Yeah, absolutely. The collegiate space is an area that I know well and my advisors know well as well. We've already had conversations with the Stanford Athletic Program, understand the buying cycle and kind of the price point that they would be interested in. So I think a really important thing to mention is those collegiate centers are often the centers of thought leadership as well. And so when you look at Stanford, they're supporting a lot of the professional sports teams in the area as well, those same positions. This is a trifecta that we found at Stanford, in Toronto, in Ottawa, in all of the locations that we're working with right now. We know that the collegiate scene will be very important. But in terms of the branding opportunity, the biggest one that we're piloting right now is the UFC. And it's really cool to see the trickle down effect into the hundreds of thousands of, semi-pro fighters that will have access to the tech.
Great. And before we get to the last two questions for Ashley today, if anybody's interested to learn more about Bill and his fund there, we'll run a poll here. You can register your interest for that. And with that, my next question for you, Ashley, is who are the main groups most concerned about concussion monitoring? Relatives of sports patients, nonprofits, who?
Yeah. Oh gosh. Certainly the families of professional athletes and youth athletes. I've got little boys in sport right now. We actually were at a tournament where a kid was concussed, knocked out, and just nothing, no support for that recovery journey. He was put back on the ice again 2 weeks later, concussed again, and out for the season. If we had access to a low-cost solution that could provide some data on this injury, then we can provide the appropriate therapeutic intervention. So this is not just a tool that's designed for pro sports. That's where we're starting to get that brand recognition. But I see this technology being adopted in youth sport across Canada and the United States. Hockey and football alone is a massive market for us. Then the other aspect, of course, is the legal battles that we've got. Athletes are becoming really empowered to take ownership of their brain health, and teams are under the gun to do a better job and to make it data-driven rather than subjective. So the owners that we speak to, the team docs that we speak to are incentivized to improve the process for sure.
Great. Our final question for the day is, who will pay for it?
Yeah, so this is why we've gone with the B2B model. The sports organizations actually have, a lot of them have a line item in their annual budget for concussion. And so there's a real faster way for us to get into the market, working with these sports organizations. The distribution partnerships that we're working on, the big one is TELUS Health right now. And that's on the employer side. So there is an opportunity to move into the employer side, specifically on the manual labor. But it's the organization that pays, and then the athlete or the employee has access to the platform. Second generation, of course, there are billing codes that could reimburse this technology, existing CPT billing codes for EEG and remote patient monitoring. So there is compensation for the physicians as well.
Great. Well, I appreciate that. That wraps up the time for today. Bill, I want to thank you for your presentation on the AMA there. And Ashley, thank you for your presentation on Neurovine. And those in the audience, thank you for joining us today and asking great questions. We'll go ahead and send the results out to everybody after the presentation is over. And I want to thank everybody for joining today and hope to see you again soon. With that, we'll go and close it out and have a good one, guys. Thanks.
Thanks.